This next episode was recorded on June 11th and is with Dr. Sarah Willen, Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Connecticut and Director of the Research Program on Global Health and Human Rights at UConn's Human Rights Institute. She's authored several articles and books in her career, and we touch on some of them, including her recent ethnography published last year called Fighting for Dignity: Migrant Lives at Israel's Margins, which philosophically centers dignity in her research in order to understand notions of vulnerability, illegality, and inequity for the various narratives that she captures concerning migrants who have settled in Israel from all over the world, such as from regions like South America, Southeast Asia, and Western Africa. At the start of the conversation, we discuss COVID-19, including the new pandemic journaling project, which she created together with Kate Mason at Brown University, along with an interdisciplinary team of students and faculty at UConn, Brown, and Trinity College. The Pandemic Journaling Project was launched on May 29th, and it aims to document people's experiences with COVID-19 in order to contribute to our historical understanding of what has happened during this time. You can contribute in English or Spanish by writing or even using audio and photo, and you can even securely download your journals. So this is a great project that professors have even found instructive for having their students contribute to, as you'll hear next week from my guest, Dr. Christina Baines from City University of New York. The project is scheduled to last as long as COVID-19 does, which does seem to be the foreseeable future. So listen in on my conversation with Dr. Willen. So how's sort of everything been during COVID-19? Because I know that work has been disrupted for nearly everybody. Last week I was interviewing someone. They were saying how academics sort of have it easier to an extent, just because like the work never sort of stops. A lot of it can be remote depending on the project, and there's like an increased flexibility. And I guess I was wondering, like, how's this time been for you in terms of like your own work and even your research?
Yeah. So I think every one of us is probably handling things differently, and every one of us is probably facing different challenges in terms of professional obligations, stuff on the home front, our own health conditions, and obviously our own social position, both in relation to COVID-19 and in relation to everything that's happening around us in this country and really reverberating around the world. So, for me, I would just say that I had a really kind of neat opportunity this semester. I was teaching a new seminar that I called Anthropology and the Writer's Craft. That was really designed as a chance for anthropology students, advanced students, undergrad and also grad, to really think about where writing fits into the work that we do as anthropologists, into the expression that we do with people outside of the field. And so we didn't go back to campus after spring break. We started meeting online. And at that point, basically, I had the chance to turn that course into a kind of a lab space for an idea that came up in conversations with colleagues. I'm a faculty member in anthropology at the University of Connecticut, and I also direct a research program on global health and human rights, which is part of our Human Rights Institute, a very interdisciplinary space with historians and philosophers and economists and literature scholars, all sorts of people. And we're pretty close. And so, as we were beginning to feel the lockdown and sort of try to begin to wrap our heads around what was happening, we were emailing with each other. And one of my colleagues, a very senior, distinguished historian, wrote to all of us and said, we should be writing this down. We should be chronicling our experiences so that historians in the future will know what was on people's minds as we were beginning to see these rates of infection skyrocket, as we were beginning to see the pressure on our healthcare system and other institutions, as we were beginning to feel, either stuck in our homes or pressured to go out into the world to do the jobs that we have to do in order to sustain the economy, sustain our families. And something about that really stuck with me. And I talked to a couple of colleagues and ended up with a group, another anthropologist, a political scientist, and then a kind of advisory board of interdisciplinary folks. We started a pandemic journaling project that has taken much of my time and much of my energy for the past couple of months now. And we used the course, my anthropology and the writer's craft course, as a lab space to begin thinking about what it would mean to journal now. what sorts of things, if we wanted to give people journaling prompts, what should we be asking people to reflect on? What prompts worked? What didn't? As anthropologists, what categories of experience should we be trying to tap into? So the undergrad and grad students in that course helped me kind of formulate some ideas. And then we worked with the advisory board that I pulled together real quickly, together with my colleague at Brown University, Kate Mason, also an anthropologist. And we just launched, and now we've got over 100 people who've signed up so far to basically take about 15 minutes a week to create a chronicle of what's happening in their lives. And we've designed this as a mixed methods project. So we've got a baseline survey and then some really short weekly survey questions. So we're able to get demographics, some psychological measures, some measures of people's trust in institutions and government, some stuff like that. And then we create this open space. And every week we're asking the question, how is the pandemic affecting you right now? So that's our first prompt each week. And then the second is we're giving people two options and they can either reflect on something that might be a little more intimate or something that might be a little more general. And, obviously we couldn't have anticipated what was going to happen. The murder of George Floyd, the response to the murder of George Floyd, the accumulation of anger and fury and rage among so many of us. But these are now intersecting social processes. They can't be disentangled. So we had to kind of go back to the IRB and ask permission to really ask people to reflect on everything that's happening together. So that's been a huge focus of my energy and attention since this all started. And it's, it's been an interesting time to be an anthropologist. I think anthropologists are trying to find ways to use our skills in different ways. And so this is sort of one little way to try and create a space for people to ask themselves exactly the question you asked me. What's going on? How is this affecting you? What's changing in your life?
Yeah, that's really incredible because it's like, new like social issues sort of emerged. It sounds like in the middle of the project, and now it's something that you've had to adapt to and to now integrate people's experiences of it, because like clearly it seems like you're really going over like, what people are experiencing personally, mentally, and even socially. And I don't know if you've had a chance to sort of look at some of the feedback, but has there anything that's like stood out to you so far? I know it's a little bit early to tell, but
it is early, but we just posted some excerpts from the first week of journaling on the website, and I can,
nice.
Certainly direct folks to the website and also to that page. I could even pull it up and share some quotes with you if you'd like. That would be an
that would be great.
interruption.
Yeah, I
Sure.
When did the project start?
So we started working on it, in mid-March, and we got our IRB approval at the end of May, very end of May, and launched a little over a week ago. And so we're in our second week. So each week folks get either an email or a text message, is up to them, asking them to take, as little as 15 minutes to reflect. And so we're in week 2 now. And we're doing a big push to try and encourage folks to participate. And one thing I didn't talk about is who we're interested in hearing from. This is open. We designed it so that anyone, anywhere in the world who's 18 or older can participate. You don't need a phone. You don't need a computer. You could just use your phone. And you can get your weekly alerts with an SMS, a text message if you want. We're up just in English right now, but we got our approval to go up in Spanish. So that'll be up very shortly as well. And we really want anyone who's interested to take this opportunity to chronicle their own experience, but we're especially interested in hearing from folks who are most intensely affected. So we want to reach out to essential workers. We want to reach out to health workers. We want to reach out to people of color in different communities. We want to reach out to people who might be feeling targeted by racist sentiments, especially Asian and Asian Americans. So we really want this to be a place where people who are feeling the impact of what's happening have a little space of their own. And folks can download everything they contribute. So it's something that people can keep for themselves and for their families and maybe for their kids one day. And it's also, when folks contribute, it becomes part of the research archive as well. And it's, in 25 years, it's going to become a public record. So we're really thinking of this as creating a collaborative data resource for researchers in a lot of different disciplines and for historians in the future.
Wow, that's really incredible. That I can totally see that connection of how it's like, yeah.
But basically the question we asked ourselves is, and this started with that initial question from my colleague who is a historian. I said to him, think about if you could pre-design your archive, what would you want to see in it? So we've designed the project so that, if a historian wanted to be able to look at the experiences of, let's say, young African-American women between the ages of 18 and 30, you could pull all of that material. Or if you wanted to look at the experience of people belonging to a particular religious community, or people who are essential workers who have to go to work and can't stay in their homes and avoid risk. What are those folks writing about and talking about? So that's how we've kind of set it up as a resource that people can use to look at different slices of how folks are experiencing things. So
that's incredible. Yeah.
It's kind of interesting, the archiving questions and the legal questions, like who does this material belong to? There are a lot of facets, but it's been a joy to put together. So I've got some material I can share with you from what folks have been talking about. A lot of people are talking about just feeling tired, feeling exhausted, feeling weary, but in different ways. So we've got one person who says, I'm so tired, existentially exhausted, the fear of COVID-19, the fear of being Black in America. Our cities are burning. We can't breathe.
Wow.
So that's one voice. Here's another. Someone wrote, I just want to touch people. I actually backed up from my husband yesterday when he approached me in the kitchen, like a new instinct that I had developed to protect myself.
Wow.
It bummed me out and startled me.
Wow, that's really incredible. Like, it's totally shifting people's perceptions of closeness now.
Right? Yeah. So, some people are looking outward at society, and some people are really, reflecting on these very intimate changes that they're feeling in their bodies, right? In their relationships, in their intimate relationships. Some people talk about hardships that they're encountering and how much more difficult they are to manage because of what's happening. So, a person having an accident in their family, someone who had a relative hit by a bicycle and is now in the hospital, and how complicated it is to manage that, because how much more complicated it is to manage that crisis because of everything going around, or surgeries, things like that. So really we're hearing from a lot of different people who have a lot of different things to say. And I have to say, in some ways, I feel like everything I've learned as an anthropologist has supported this work, being able to think about when can we use qualitative questions and qualitative methods? When can we ask quantitative questions and use quantitative methods? How can we think with scholars in other fields, right? In history or psychology or public health? How do we use technology to create a space where people are feeling like they have some ownership and they have some control over the way their stories are told? Often we think of technology as kind of forcing itself on people and taking away agency in research contexts. And here, even though I won't meet these people unless we go through another IRB amendment and get permission to do interviews, which we may do at some point. We're asking ethnographic questions and giving people the space in writing, or by uploading audio, or by using a kind of photo voice method where they upload a photo and talk about it. We're giving space for people to say what's on their minds in a way that might have some kind of cathartic value in terms of sort of lightening the load, and that also has this historical value and anthropological and sociological value as well.
Yeah, a big thing that stood out to me when you were describing that project initially was how, it's interdisciplinary, that you had historians, philosophers, like a lot of people of various disciplines. And I definitely, imagine being an anthropologist has been helpful in being able to navigate all those things, just because the flexibility is inherent, because you're both working with quantitative and qualitative research. And, having read your most recent book, like you also deal with a
Oh,
lot of
thank you.
philosophical issues as well. And I guess how has the experience been in navigating that? Like, what have been some of the interactions with like that interdisciplinary work?
It's interesting. It feels very natural to me. I think in part because, as you said, that's how we are as anthropologists, right? We're trained to play well with others,
Hmm.
and to think well with others, and to communicate respectfully with people who bring other methodologies to the table and other research questions to the table than those that come most kind of naturally to us. Um, so it's really been wonderful. In fact, one of the first things we did was create a giant Google Doc, a giant
Hmm.
spreadsheet, where we put up the quantitative measures we were thinking of using, the survey questions, and we put up the narrative prompts that we were thinking of asking people, and just opened it up to everybody and said, all right, folks, go to town. What do you see? What's missing? How
Hmm.
should we ask these questions? Are we asking these survey questions in the right way, or should we ask them differently? Um, are we proposing the right kinds of narrative prompts that are going to get at the material we want to analyze, or do you have new ideas?
Hmm.
And so it's just been really really wonderful to see, like the art historians and the Asian American studies folks say, you've got some crappy survey questions, you got to redo those, and then have to come back and say, yeah, they're problematic. At the same time, if we want to be able to compare to this other material, we have to think about using like a validated question.
Hmm.
So to think about the struggles methodologically, how you ask questions has been really wonderful. And then in terms of, the narrative prompt, I've got undergrads who've proposed questions that we're definitely going to answer. And I've got senior colleagues who've asked questions that are, sort of topically very interesting, but they're not ethnographers, so they don't know how to ask a question,
Hmm.
right? So, and
Yeah.
then everything in between. So it's been very democratic, and we haven't, our advisory board includes faculty and also students, which is really cool.
Nice.
Also, that we really want to make this an opportunity for sort of lots of different people to think about what we should be generating in terms of data, and also for lots of different people to contribute their own material, and use this space as an opportunity to create their own record and to participate in basically making history.
Yeah, that's really cool that you've like integrated like students and faculty almost at every level. It sounds like the fact
Tried.
that it really started off with this collaborative project and with your students in your class and how it sort of blew up. That's really incredible to see because you know that it's something that a lot of scholars want to work at and trying to integrate
Mhm.
as many voices, and to see how it actually came together and how collaborative, like the nitty gritty of creating a Google document and everything, it sounds really, really amazing. Yeah,
It's
that's
been pretty fun. So it's called the Pandemic Journaling Project,
right.
and it's on the web, and we're on Facebook and Twitter and now Instagram too.
Nice.
Um, and the other amazing thing is that it's all been created, from our little spaces where we are, right? So this little office where I'm sitting right now
Hmm.
is where most of that work has happened on my end.
Yeah,
And so it's just the fact that technology has allowed us to do this work despite the constraints we're facing is pretty extraordinary.
it is. And how long do you envision the project going for?
It's a good question. So we basically have proposed to keep going every week until WHO has declared the pandemic over.
Wow. Yeah.
And then, following up, and we'll see how long people participate. People might get tired and drop out. I'm not sure how long folks will stick with it, but that's our goal.
Yeah. That's really incredible. I do look forward to seeing like what other things people are sharing. And a big part that you talked about was how people have different like experiences depending on like ultimately like their social location in terms of race, class, ethnicity, and all the things that we think about.
Yep.
And your work has dealt with like migrant issues, and your most
Mm-hmm.
recent book, which was released last year, Fighting for Dignity: Migrant Lives at Israel's Margins, um,
Mm-hmm.
really touches on like the notion of dignity from like a philosophical view and an anthropological view. And I
Mm-hmm.
I really am fascinated because when we talk about migrant issues, usually in the U.S., we talk about like Hispanic or Latino communities, or
Mm-hmm.
very like I know I'm coming from California and L.A., and Long Beach is like one of the places with the largest Cambodian communities. And
Mm-hmm.
here in Tampa, USF, there's a large Congolese refugee community here.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I guess I'd like to hear like what sort of drew you towards this research in Israel, and
Mhm.
what's just sort of what those experiences have been.
Sure. Wow. So there are shorter and longer versions of the story. I'll give you a sort of medium length version. So the book that you've mentioned and that you have read, which I appreciate so much, is a product of almost 2 decades of work in Israel, which is, as anyone who's listening knows, is a very complicated place, fraught, difficult, controversial, you name it. It's a tough place to think about. It's a tough place to talk about. It's a tough place to have a relationship to.
Mm.
And I have a relationship to it. And I have my whole life, because I was born into a Jewish family at a time when what that meant was that if you were being raised Jewish, that you would have a relationship with Israel. That wasn't even a question. So that's my reality. That's my upbringing. That was my childhood and my young adulthood and much of my life. And I'm proud to be Jewish, and I love being Jewish. And it's influenced my thinking as an anthropologist, and it's influenced my choice making as an anthropologist too. And so for me, to a large extent, the work of conducting ethnographic research with migrants who are not welcome in Israel has been a process of coming to see a country I was raised to celebrate unquestioningly in a new light. I visited Israel as a teenager. I spent a couple of years living there after college, really as a young adult, trying to figure out what the country was about, to sort of lift the hood, understand in greater depth, how it worked, what made things tick. I worked actually in politics for a couple of years. This was in the mid-90s, which was a very, very different time from right now. This was the period when the Oslo Accords had been signed, and it looked like there was going to be peace, something called peace. A lot of us, I think, who came of age in that period had great hopes and expectations that have subsequently been dashed in many respects. So those of us who came of age and have a relationship to the region, at least a relationship similar to my relationship, might sort of still be stuck in a sense that things could have been different. I think people who grew up, with different sets of commitments might never have expected there to be any peaceful resolution to the conflict. So in any event, what I'm saying in a sort of long-winded way is that I came to Israel before graduate school, hoping to understand the region better. But I didn't plan to do ethnography there. I went to graduate school saying, I will work anywhere else in the world. I'm not going to work in Israel. It's just too close. It's too intimate. I can't do it.
Yeah.
Couple of grant proposals down the road, couple of changes of heart down the road, I decided that in fact I did want to work in Israel, but I needed, if I were to do that, I needed to be looking at Israeli society and at the Israeli state from the perspective of a group of people that was not seen as being part of the us. And this was a time when Israel was just beginning to welcome, in some respects, it was beginning to welcome migrant workers from around the world, specifically in response to a labor need, right? So the first Intifada, the first Palestinian national uprising, was in the late 1980s. Palestinians were the mainstay of some major labor sectors, the agricultural sector, the construction sector in particular. And in response to the first Intifada, the Israeli government slammed down the borders and wouldn't allow Palestinians to work in the Israeli labor market. And the response from those big employers was, well, we need workers, let's recruit from abroad. And so with some reluctance, the Israeli government granted permission, and Israel began recruiting documented workers to work with visas in those sectors, in agriculture and construction, and a couple of others. And then in due time, folks started coming through other migration pathways and finding work in Israel as well. This is the late 1990s, mid to late 1990s, and then into the early 2000s. And that's when I began my ethnographic research, at a time when Israel had pretty recently become a home to folks from all over the world who were seeking economic opportunity, some coming through authorized channels, some coming through as tourists and sticking around. And I came and started working with flourishing, thriving communities in Tel Aviv, and it was pretty exciting. And then about halfway through my field work, things got really complicated and really ugly when the Israeli government decided to start deporting people en masse and initiated a mass deportation campaign that became, that really transformed everything for the communities I was working with. That was really quite difficult to witness and try and respond to as an ethnographer, and that became really the focus of the book that I eventually wrote.
Yeah. Wow. It sounds like a lot of political, personal, and like a lot of issues are converging here, both like anthropologically and personally. I think one of the things that stuck out was like who's considered like a migrant, authorized, unauthorized, what the attitudes are. I think that's one of the big things that stood out in the book. But I guess for yourself personally, first of all, I guess I want to commend you on just like pursuing a research that was so like personal and really like something that seemed like you said, like almost something you didn't really want to pursue. Because I can imagine that's so difficult, and it's something so like personal, both near and dear, but also maybe a little too personal. And the fact that you're able to pursue that is really sort of great to see, because, the personal stuff can sometimes be like the best kind of research. Maybe you were the best person to even take it on to begin with.
Well, I don't know that I would be so presumptuous as to say that, but I do think that, when I'm advising my students, I try to share the advice that was given to me, which is that, when you're choosing a dissertation topic, it has to come from a really deep place, because you're going to live with that topic for probably a good 10 years, if not longer.
Right.
In my case, it was much longer. Right. So it has to be something that you care about deeply enough that you're willing to sacrifice other things in life to make it happen. And I do feel really just extraordinarily fortunate that I had the opportunity to spend this time probing and pushing and trying to understand a country, a time period, communities, and individual people who all converged at a moment that I think the convergence of those different topics and facets afforded me an opportunity to think really deeply about one case of much broader processes that we're seeing around the world, right? Certainly in the United States, in Western Europe, in parts of Southeast Asia. We're living in a moment in which people are on the move, have been on the move, are settled into places where they continue to be judged and treated as not welcome and excluded in really fundamental, categorical, defining ways, often because of the ways in which people are racialized as part of the us, racialized as not part of the us, with profound consequences, right? With consequences for health, consequences for how we feel about ourselves, consequences for families, consequences sometimes in terms of life and death. So to have had the chance to really spend time thinking deeply about one instance of a much broader set of processes and phenomena was pretty extraordinary. I think it's something that anthropology affords us, and I also know that I have a lot of privilege that made it possible for me to carve out time in my life to do that work. And I hope that in what I write and what I produce, I'm honoring and showing respect to the people who chose to welcome me into their experience and into their lives.
Right. Yeah, that's really incredible to hear. And over, I'd say, the last couple of years, I've read a lot of like migrant literature. With Heidi Castaneda being my advisor, and
my good friend,
yeah,
colleague.
There was one of your work that I read. I can't remember if you mentioned it in your book or not, but it was how in talking with some like Israeli citizens, some of them said that they hadn't even ever seen like a Black person before in their lives, and how like in some ways, like, you know, migrants are sort of, I guess in every sense around the world, like having to, in a lot of ways, negotiate different identities, but also the very notion of citizenship, like it gives a person so much. It gives a person so much socially, economically, in terms of privileges and advantages, but also even what we imagine to be like the citizen, whether, you know, each of us has like, or, you know, a country can sort of develop what that looks like. And I guess that was one of the interesting things about your book, is that there were so many, like, you know, migrants from all over the world, from Colombia, from like just everywhere. And that sort of surprised me. And I guess I was wondering, like, what was that experience to see those diversity of migrants coming there? And what were some of the experiences that really stood out to you personally?
Sure. So, so I, you know, one of my field sites was a clinic for migrants and other people with different forms of irregular status that was founded in Tel Aviv in 1998. It's run by an NGO called Physicians for Human Rights Israel, which itself is a fascinating organization with its own complex history. And the place of this clinic in that organization is interesting and complicated.
Right.
But this clinic basically opened up because there was nowhere for migrants without some form of regularized status to go for healthcare. You could go to the ER, right? You could go to the emergency room. But many people didn't want to do that. And so even in dire situations, folks wouldn't go. So there wasn't a place to go. Also, you know, in the late 90s, this is a period when communities had been around long enough that people were having children. And where were the children going to go for healthcare? So the clinic basically sprang up in South Tel Aviv, which is a neighborhood significantly populated by different migrant communities then and also now, but now it's different migrant communities. And pretty much, you know, I sort of got myself permission to volunteer pretty regularly, and whoever walked in the door was whoever would get treated. And folks came in speaking, you know, dozens of languages. From at one point, one of the clinic staff members and I did a kind of back of the envelope calculation. I think I read about this in the book to just get a sense of how many countries were represented in the patient files, which at that time was probably around 7,000 or so. And we counted around 63 countries. Wow. Represented. So there were folks, you know, certainly from South America, there were folks from Western Africa, from Southern Africa, Eastern Europe, different parts of Asia, really from around the world. It was pretty astonishing. You can think about the language challenges that would come up in a clinic like that, where you've got volunteer clinicians who probably know Hebrew, English, maybe another language. And if they did, it would probably be Spanish or Russian, which in some cases was helpful, but often wasn't. So, you know, to try and support a clinic like that was pretty challenging, you know, again, as a participant observer. And this is not a space that had funding for interpreters, right? This is a space where you did the best you could. Sometimes in cases where people had not been able to receive care for very serious conditions for an extended period of time. So you can imagine you've got people with advanced cancers, or people with very serious chronic conditions, diabetes, blood pressure, you know, multimorbidities, you know, under the kind of syndemic circumstances you can imagine. Right. Folks with HIV, pretty much you name a condition and you had people coming through the door with it who may or may not have been able to articulate their needs or their pain or their suffering in a language that was intelligible to the clinicians available. So, you know, I would say on one hand, you know, as a participant observer, I would juggle, you know, the sense of being amazed at the fact the clinicians and the staff were there volunteering their time to try and provide something, and also thinking analytically about just how extraordinarily dysfunctional societies are, such that you have hundreds and hundreds and thousands of people who have these really basic needs, right? Some of us think healthcare is a fundamental human right,
Right.
and everyone should be able to receive care when they're sick, and that it's, unconscionable for us as humans to be alive in the 21st century and have people not receiving care that's totally available technologically for basic, needs. So, if you sort of have that disposition that it's unconscionable that people should be neglected when they're suffering, and you're in a clinic where you've got all these people with very serious needs, quite often not being cared for, and you've got people who care deeply and want to meet that need, but are constrained by systems and structures, or constrained by financial limitations, or constrained by their own internalized views of who isn't part of society, right? So even among the volunteers, we would hear sometimes people ranking the value of patients coming in the door, right?
Right.
We talk about hierarchies of inclusion and exclusion. We think about the ways in which we all internalize racism. I would see that among the volunteers in the clinic, the staff, and also the clinicians, and I would see it in myself too, right? And that's one of those tough things that we have to learn to recognize, that we want to sharpen our capacity to see what happens when systems and structures are organized in ways that are unjust. We also have to invest time and energy in sharpening our lenses on our own complicity with those systems and structures. And that's not easy to do. And that's, some of these complexities can make it hard to write too, right? They can make it hard to participate and observe, and they can make it hard to write and articulate our analyses in ways that are going to be meaningful and effective.
Right. And thinking about all those structures and all the limitations that people can experience, I mean, that's definitely like relevant for this like current cultural moment in terms of the protests and
Sure.
regards in response to the George Floyd murder. And you also mentioned like health issues and how they're also really implicated in all of those things. And you also brought up the term syndemics, and you wrote a few years ago, I co-authored a paper on syndemic vulnerability, which also, looks at those structural issues and how they are intertwined with health in that really intimate way. And you're the first guest that I've had that has brought up syndemics. So I don't know if you'd like to have the honor of sort of defining it just for viewers and sort of talking about how syndemics and syndemic vulnerability in particular, like what that is.
Sure. Oh, goodness. That's a responsibility I'm not sure I'm best equipped to carry. But, I would first acknowledge that this is a term that was developed by my colleague at the University of Connecticut, now emeritus, Marl Singer, together with some colleagues, and has more recently been developed quite robustly by Emily Mendenhall at Georgetown. And anything I think about syndemics leans very, very heavily on the work that both of them have done. So in the piece that you mentioned, which came out in the Lancet a couple years ago, I had the opportunity to work with a couple of colleagues in thinking about the ways in which people's likelihood of being ill or injured and their likelihood of getting the care they need or not is shaped by both their social location and also the ways in which they may be experiencing multiple health conditions that interact, often in deleterious ways and in ways that are harmful. So, in a sort of simple sense, you could say syndemics offers another way of thinking about what clinicians sometimes call comorbidity, right? The coexistence of different health conditions. We could think of high blood pressure and diabetes, or we could think about diabetes and depression, which Emily Mendenhall has written about a lot. Or we could think about, if we link back to Marl Singer's earlier work, tuberculosis and HIV. So it's not a coincidence that serious health conditions often occur together. So syndemics offers us a way of recognizing that health conditions, often deeply harmful health conditions, can occur together. And so that's the first piece, the co-occurrence. And here's the second piece, that they can interact with each other either one heightens vulnerability to the other, or one aggravates the other, or both. So that's our second piece, the interaction. And the third piece is context, right? And as anthropologists, as critical medical anthropologists, we're always attuned to context. And so, not only is it not random that we see the frequent co-occurrence of adverse health conditions, but it's also not a coincidence that those co-occurrences tend to happen among people facing other kinds of vulnerability, other kinds of structural vulnerability, in terms of the ways in which people in communities are racialized, in terms of access to education, in terms of vulnerability to violence, in terms of access to transportation, in terms of the broader economic circumstances of a community, or the level of safety of a community in which people live. So all of those social determinants of health, all of those structural determinants of health, play a very significant role in who ends up being susceptible to concurrent health conditions that can then interact in ways that can aggravate one another. So that's my best shot at syndemics on one foot.
Yeah, no, that was really great. It really was comprehensive. It did touch on all the aspects of it, and I know, yeah, it's definitely something that a lot of, I think, other disciplines are touching on now. Public health, nursing, and other ones as well are really gravitating towards syndemics because it does highlight those interactions. And how I'm sorry.
If I could just add one piece, and I think in the piece that my colleagues and I wrote, we found that it's helpful to think not only in terms of mapping and tracking syndemic processes, which some folks in public health have been doing, often using quantitative methodologies, but also to just have a kind of sensitivity to the ways in which syndemics can emerge. And that's really the argument we're trying to make in that Lancet piece, that having an understanding of syndemics, of those three components, the co-occurrence of adverse conditions, the interaction or potential interaction among them, and the role of context in shaping the occurrence and interaction, that having that sensitivity to the ways in which those factors play out can help us think about lots of different populations that are vulnerable to not one, sometimes not two, sometimes multiple adverse health conditions. And obviously you can see how a sensitivity to that kind of vulnerability emerges if you work with migrants, because migrants are so often facing that multiple, that complex and multiple kind of disadvantage and exclusion with health implications that really can be quite grave.
Yeah. And something that you touched on in your book, and the second chapter was about dignity and defining it, and the different types of dignity. And the one that you gravitated towards was the one that you referred to as being the most anthropological, in that it referred to dignity as a receptacle, I think, and ultimately the way that we look at dignity, view it, and even our values around it are shaped by religious institutions, cultural, social, all these different things ultimately feed into how we look at dignity. And how do you think dignity really intersects with the health issues and the structural barriers that you're talking about?
That's a great question. So what we've been talking about now, when we talk about syndemics and we talk about syndemic vulnerability, we're really talking about the ways in which the organization of society can impose itself on people in ways that hurt, in ways that damage, in ways that cause harm. But I think, anthropologists in general, and folks who describe themselves as critical medical anthropologists in particular, and I would count myself in that group, have increasingly come to say it's not enough to just talk about suffering, right? We've been talking about it for a long time. We've got some great tools for thinking about how people are harmed by systems and structures, and we need them. We really, really need them. We need them now more than ever. At the same time, if our analyses stop there, what kind of scholarship are we producing? And what kind of relationship do we have to the folks who have spent time teaching us about their lives? We also have an obligation to hear life happen, to hear struggle happen, to hear joy, and to hear searching and striving and pleasure and gratification. All of those aspects of human experience are vital. And to recognize that people are, if you'll forgive me, to recognize that people are being screwed over by many of the systems and structures shaping their lives is one piece. But we also have to make sure that as anthropologists, we're celebrating life. We're celebrating the pushback. We're celebrating the resistance. We're celebrating the creative innovation. We're celebrating the ways in which people reconfigure their worlds to experience joy, the ways in which people refuse to be vanquished, and persist in working to achieve the things that they care about most. So I write about, and I kind of play a little bit because there's a ton that's been written about dignity, a lot by people in philosophy and political theory and law, and often the ways in which people talk about dignity in those disciplines, to my taste, is a little, sometimes it's schematic, sometimes it's overly theoretical or abstract, and often it's just distant from the realities of everyday life. And as an ethnographer, that's my commitment to the realities of everyday life, to the realities of everyday struggle. And so when I'm talking about dignity, I play a little bit to try and escape the limitations of those more abstract definitions of dignity. And I say, look, my focus is on the sense of dignity, people's experiences of struggling to feel recognized, to feel grounded and secure existentially, to feel honored, to feel valued. So that's, I try and capture that experience by talking about a sense of dignity and the pursuit of one's sense of dignity, which isn't something objective, right? You can't have a definition that you can plop onto every individual. Everyone's going to understand what it means to feel like their sense of dignity is being honored in a different way. And that's, I think, really important. The other thing that I find helpful is to think about dignity, again, not as something that can ever be achieved or attained, as something static, but as something in motion. So I write about dignity in motion as something that's always being pursued. And maybe it never will be achieved. Maybe one will never fully feel that one's sense of dignity has been realized. But that doesn't mean that we stop trying to feel that way, right? It doesn't mean we give up on that striving. So that, to me, is just a really fundamental piece of what it means to be an ethnographer, to be listening to the ways in which people aren't going to let themselves be stuck in a box, stuck in a category. People are much more extraordinary than that. Ordinary people are extraordinary in that we're always striving.
Wow.
That, to me, is probably the most important thing I've learned as an ethnographer.
Yeah, that's really incredible because, it's like we started off talking about like a lot of the structures and the things that are at play, and now it's like touching back on what ethnography really gets at are those narratives. And yeah, your book was filled with narratives, and that's a big part of what I appreciated, is hearing all these stories of people's lives and what they're going through. And dignity just seems like the point where people are striving for, where people are acting, and it's such a good sort of piece, through which to trace all the other things people are doing in their lives through dignity. And I think that was a really sort of brilliant philosophical piece to really integrate in there.
Well, I appreciate that. I will say that my original title for the book was more playful. I wanted to call it Indignity and Indignation, because I wanted to capture both the ways in which systems and structures harm and humiliate, and also the ways in which people push back and become indignant. And in the book, I talk about both migrants and also Israeli activists who refuse complicity, right? So in both of those spaces, we see this kind of indignation, a sense that there's work to do. and
Right.
that we're on a journey to either realize our own sense of dignity or to help others realize theirs, or both.
Right. Yeah. Um, so how, I guess sort of as a, like a last question, just to
Mhm.
finish this off, I was wondering if there's anything else you'd like to share or, close us off, whether it's in terms of the pandemic journaling project, some of your research, some of your thinking in anthropology. Sort of the floor is yours.
Wow. Well, I haven't had time to prepare any kind of response, so I'm going to go totally on the fly here. And I would say that for those of us who are anthropologists, and that doesn't mean you have a degree, that means you are an anthropologist in your heart. For those of us who are anthropologists, in particular, those of us who are ethnographers, this is a moment to really sharpen our listening skills, and also to sharpen uh, our participant observation skills, maybe emphasis on the participant. I think some disciplines are happy to sit on the sidelines and watch history happen and watch change happen or become stymied and not happen. As anthropologists, we have a different legacy. We have a complex legacy. We have a history that doesn't always make us proud. I think this is a moment in which we have the conceptual tools, we have the methodological tools to, I won't say recuperate our discipline. I think it's much more complicated than that. But I think this is a moment in which all of those who are either practicing anthropologists or who have studied a little bit of anthropology, and that could be one class, all of us are able to use those tools from our discipline to listen better, to listen to the ways in which society is seeing us, which might not accord with how we see ourselves. That might require some thought and some introspection, and to think about how the insights that we gain by listening better and by being self-reflective and self-critical, even if it hurts, can help us work toward this larger struggle of creating a society that we're proud to inhabit. Because I think a lot of us are not very proud of the society we're living in right now. I think a lot of us see that there's a tremendous amount of work to do, and that work's going to have to be on ourselves, on our institutions of higher education, on our institutions of government, on all our institutions. We have a lot of work to do, and I think anthropology has a lot to offer as we try and wrap our heads around that work.
Right. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciated getting to talk to you about your work and your projects. And I hope you have a really great summer.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity. I've enjoyed it tremendously. I hope folks will check out the Pandemic Journaling Project and maybe think about journaling with us as well, and inviting others to journal too, in English or in Spanish. I wish us all health and safety and a good dose of revolution.